If you travelled on a British road in the second half of the last century, you travelled behind a Leyland, the name on the lorries that hauled the nation's coal and steel, on the buses that carried London to work, a word that across half the world simply meant truck. At its height, the company built around 40,000 lorries a year and held roughly a third of its home market. It had swallowed almost every great British marque, AEC, Guy, Scania, Albion, to become the fifth largest vehicle maker on Earth. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the loss of the empire markets. It was backed by the personal will of a prime minister and over £1 billion of public money. And then, within 20 years, the British heavy lorry was effectively extinct. How does an industry that built the trucks of an empire and was handed everything it asked for simply disappear from its own roads? Chapter 1. The Familiar Giant. In 1970, if you stood at the side of almost any British road and watched the lorries go by, you were watching a British industry at work. The names on the radiator grills were names that had been built in British towns by British hands. Leyland, AEC, Guy, Scania, Albion, Foden and ERF and Atkinson. The heavy goods that moved this country, the coal, the steel, the bricks, the beer, moved on wheels turned by engines, designed and cast and assembled within these islands. Today, not one indigenous British-owned firm designs a heavy truck. The factory at Leyland, in Lancashire, still stands and still builds lorries. Around 1,300 people work there, but the trucks they build are DAF trucks, Dutch designs, owned by an American corporation called PACCAR. The works survived. What it was for did not. Here is the measure of what happened, and it is a hard one. In the early 1970s, Leyland built around 40,000 lorries a year. By 1983, that number had fallen to 11,000. Across the same span, the company's share of its own home market, a market it had once led without serious challenge, collapsed from roughly 30% to 13%. At the very top of the range, in the heaviest tractor units, the territory that had once belonged to AEC and Scania, a Swedish firm called Volvo now sold nearly twice as many trucks as Leyland did. This is the story of how that happened. It is a story with a title that points at one man, and part of what we'll find is how much and how little that title tells the truth. A nation that built the lorries of the empire, that built the trucks which carried armies across 2 world wars, took almost every independent maker it had and folded them into a single enterprise, the largest of its kind the country had ever assembled, the 5th largest vehicle manufacturer on Earth at the moment of its birth. And within 20 years, the British heavy lorry, born in 1896, was effectively extinct. It did not die because Britain forgot how to build trucks. The men who could build them were still there in Southall and Watford and Wolverhampton, right up until the gates closed. It died because of decisions. And to understand the decisions, we have to start with the man who made the largest of them. Though, as we'll see, he did not make it alone, and he did not make it first. Chapter 2. How Britain built the world's lorries. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with steam and with ambition in a small Lancashire town. In 1896, in Leyland, a man named James Sumner went into partnership with Henry Spurrier to form the Lancashire Steam Motor Company. Their first product was a steam-powered van that could carry 1.5 tons. The following year, at the Royal Agricultural Society trials, it won a silver medal. It was a modest beginning for a name that would, within a few decades, become a synonym for lorry across half the world. By 1907, they had renamed themselves Leyland Motors, and the name was already travelling. What made the British truck industry remarkable was not one company. It was the spread of them, fiercely independent, each rooted in its own town, each with its own character and its own loyal customers who would buy nothing else. Down in West London, at Southall, stood the Associated Equipment Company, AEC. To every passenger on the Great Western Railway, the giant trackside sign was a familiar sight. Builders of London's buses for 50 years. And so they were. AEC built the Routemaster, the most beloved bus this country ever made. They built the Mammoth Major and the Mandata and the Matador, and they built engines that hauliers trusted the way a sailor trusts the tide. The great oil engines, the 9.6 and the 11.3 and the magnificent AV760. AEC was an engineering company in the deepest sense. Its reputation had been earned over decades, one reliable mile at a time. In Wolverhampton, at Fallings Park, Sydney Guy had founded Guy Motors on the 30th of May, 1914. When war came, Guy built thousands of Arab buses to keep the cities moving through the blackout. Their lorries went out to South Africa and Pakistan and the Netherlands. Guy was not the largest of the British makers, but it was profitable, it was respected, and the men who worked there built things that lasted. And at Watford, on Tolpits Lane, stood Scammell, the kings of the heaviest haulage there was. If a load was too big, too heavy, too impossible for anything else on the road, it went on a Scammell. In 1929, their engineer Oliver Danson North designed an articulated lorry that could carry 100 tons. They built the Pioneer and the Mechanical Horse, and later the great contractor and commander tank transporters that moved the British Army's armour. Scammell did not do volume. Scammell did the things no one else could do. There were more. Albion in Glasgow, acquired by Leyland in 1951, Thornycroft at Basingstoke, the proudly independent Foden and ERF at Sandbach, Atkinson and Seddon nearby, Park Royal and Charles H. Rowe building the bodies, and the reach of all this was extraordinary. Through the 40s, 50s and 60s, British lorries went out across the Commonwealth and the world. Leyland licensed its engines to Finland, to a firm called Sisu. In 1955, Ashok Leyland began building trucks in India, a name that survives and thrives there to this day. And Leyland sold an engine license to a Dutch firm in Eindhoven called DAF. Remember that name. It will come back at the very end of this story, in a way nobody in Leyland could have imagined. This was the inheritance, a scattered, quarrelsome, brilliant collection of independent firms, each one a world unto itself, together making Britain one of the great truck-building nations on earth. The men who would soon bring them all under one roof believed they were making that inheritance stronger. They were certain bigger would mean better. They were wrong, but to understand why they believed it, we have to meet the man at the centre of it all. Chapter 3. The Salesman. Donald Stokes was born in Plymouth on the 22nd of March, 1914, the only son of the city's traffic manager. Modest, respectable, middle-class origins. He went to Blundell's School in Tiverton, and then, in 1930, at the age of 16, he began an engineering apprenticeship at Leyland Motors. But Donald Stokes was never really an engineer. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story, so hold on to it. What Stokes had was something rarer and, in its way, more powerful. He could sell. He could walk into a room of strangers in a foreign city and walk out with an order. During the war, he served in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, rising to lieutenant colonel, and when he came back to Leyland in 1946, he went to his chairman with an argument. Leyland, he said, needed a proper export drive, and he was the man to lead it. He was right. This was, by his own reckoning, the most successful period of his business life. Through the late 40s and the 50s, Stokes built Leyland's overseas trade into something formidable. He became a kind of media figure, the dashing British salesman who could close a deal anywhere. He famously sold a fleet of London-style buses to Castro's Cuba, the whole thing paid for out of the fares the buses would collect. In 1964, he won the very first award the Institute of Marketing and Sales Management ever gave. The next year, he produced a government report on defence exports that was accepted by the ministry, and he was knighted for it. You can see, can't you, why people believed in him. He was dynamic, articulate, unstuffy. Tony Benn, who would later watch him at close quarters, called him a buccaneer. He could command a room in Tokyo or Turin, spoke several languages, and had a gift for the provocative phrase that made him wonderful copy for the newspapers. In 1963, he became managing director of Leyland. By 1967, he was chairman. In 1968, he would take charge of the largest motor company in British history. In 1969, he was made a life peer. Baron Stokes of Leyland. He even sat, for a time, on the board of the government body that was busy reshaping British industry. But here is the flaw, and his own finance director saw it clearly. His talent, as one obituary put it, lay in improvisation and personal dynamism, rather than in the establishment of management systems and careful long-term planning. Stokes could win the order. What he could not do, what perhaps he never learned to do, was build the patient, ruthless, unglamorous machinery of management that turns a collection of factories into a disciplined manufacturing business. John Barber, who became his finance director, said something about him later that lands like an epitaph. "In many ways," Barber said, "he was too kind a man to have taken over BMH. Too kind. It is not the usual charge laid against the man blamed for destroying an industry, but it may be closer to the truth than the title of this film suggests. Stokes himself had an image for what his life in business felt like. He said he had been like a man walking quickly in front of a steamroller. For years he stayed ahead of it. In the end, it caught him." Chapter 4. Bigger is better. To understand what happened next, you have to understand that the Great Merger was not Donald Stokes' idea. It was the policy of a government. In the mid-1960s, Harold Wilson's Labour government had become gripped by a particular conviction about the future of British industry. The conviction was this, that Britain's firms were too small to compete with the giants of America and Europe, that what the country needed were national champions. Single, dominant enterprises in each industry, large enough to take on General Motors and Ford and Volkswagen on equal terms. Bigger, the thinking went, would mean stronger. Bigger would mean better. To make this happen, the government created a body called the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, the IRC, chaired by Sir Frank Kearton. Its explicit job was to engineer mergers. And in the motor industry, its great ambition was to build a British General Motors. Stokes had already been assembling pieces of his own. Leyland had taken Albion back in 1951 and Scania in 1955, though, tellingly, both were largely left to fend for themselves. In 1961, Leyland bought Standard Triumph, its first move into cars. In 1962, it took the Associated Commercial Vehicles Group, and with it, AEC, Thornycroft, Maudslay, Crossley, Park Royal, and Charles H. Rowe, all in one stroke. In 1967, it added Rover. But the real prize, the move that would make or break everything, was the merger with British Motor Holdings, BMH. BMH was the larger company. It owned Austin and Morris, and MG and Jaguar and Daimler, and it owned, critically for our story, the truck makers Guy and the Morris commercial business. To merge Leyland with BMH would be to bring nearly every significant British truck marque under a single owner. Harold Wilson wanted it badly. In October 1967, he summoned Stokes and Sir George Harriman, the BMH chairman, to Chequers and pressed them hard. Tony Benn, as Minister of Technology, drove the political machinery. Kearton's IRC made £25 million available as loan capital, and Kearton told the reluctant men of BMH plainly that if they didn't agree, a hostile takeover was the alternative. It was, in the end, almost impossible to refuse. On the 17th of January 1968, the British Leyland Motor Corporation was born. Harriman, chairman of the larger company, agreed to terms essentially dictated by Stokes. It was, in substance, a takeover of the bigger firm by the smaller one's management. And so, BLMC came into being, the world's fifth largest vehicle manufacturer, behind only General Motors, Ford, Chrysler and Volkswagen. 48 factories, 5,000 dealers, 180,000 employees. The truck and bus division alone would employ 31,000 people across a dozen sites. On paper, it was a colossus, a British General Motors at last. But a colossus assembled from rivals is not the same as a colossus built with purpose. And the first great decision, the one that would determine whether this giant could ever actually work, was about to be made. Or rather, it was about to be abandoned. Chapter 5. The surgery that never came. John Barber understood what the merger required. If you were going to take Leyland and AEC and Guy and Scania and all the rest, and BMH's vast car business on top, and weld them into a single working enterprise, you could not simply leave everything where it was. There was too much duplication, too many factories making overlapping things, too many people. Barber wanted to cut. At the formation of the company, he wanted to shed around 30,000 jobs, to perform the hard, painful surgery that might have turned a bloated merger into a lean and genuinely competitive manufacturer. The plan leaked, the unions revolted, and Stokes, the salesman, the man who, in Barber's words, was too kind, backed down. He cited union opposition. The surgery was abandoned at the very moment it was most needed, on practically the first day of the company's life. It is hard to overstate what this meant. From that moment, British Leyland was locked into its own contradictions. The duplicated factories stayed open. The overlapping model ranges stayed in production. The warring marques stayed at war. As one historian of the company put it, once the Leyland men had established their dominance over the former BMH executives, their ruthless managerial approach evaporated into thin air, and the marques really were at war. At the heavy end of the new group, Leyland and AEC had been bitter rivals for decades. These were not friendly cousins being reunited. These were enemies being ordered to share a house. When the merger went through, the Leyland men toured the other plants, going, as it was described, to see what new ideas were in the cupboard. They came not as partners, but as victors, and they used their dominance against the firms they had spent a generation trying to beat. You cannot dissolve that kind of tribal loyalty by drawing a new box on an organisation chart. The men of Southall did not stop being AEC men, because a document in London now said they worked for Leyland. They believed, with real justification, that they built better engines than Leyland did. And soon they would be asked to prove it, under conditions that no engineer would have chosen. There was one more decision baked into the structure of this new giant, and it was perhaps the quietest and most damaging of them all. The truck and bus division was profitable, genuinely, reliably profitable. The car division, increasingly, was not, and so a decision was made and sustained for the better part of a decade that would starve the strong to feed the weak. The profits the trucks earned would be used to prop up the cars. The one part of British Leyland that was actually winning was about to be bled to keep alive the part that was losing. Nobody announced this as a policy. Nobody had to. It simply became the way things were done. Chapter 6. The works at full cry. But step back from the boardroom for a moment, because in these years, the late 60s into the early 70s, the works themselves were still magnificent things, and the men inside them were still building trucks the world wanted. Walk into Southall in 1968, and you walked into one of the great engineering establishments in Europe. The AEC Works was a place where engines were not merely assembled, but conceived, designed, tested, and perfected. The smell hit you first: hot oil and machined metal, the particular tang of cutting fluid, and underneath it all the deep mineral smell of cast iron. The floor carried the sound of it, the steady percussion of the machine shop, the test cells where engines ran for hour after hour at full load, the deep note of a big diesel being pushed to its limits behind heavy doors. The men who worked here knew what they were. AEC engineers were among the best in the country, and they knew it, and the knowledge was earned. The AV760 engine, 12.5 litres, smooth and strong and durable, was a piece of equipment that hauliers would build a business around. You bought an AEC because it would still be earning its keep when cheaper lorries had long since been weighed in for scrap. At Leyland itself, in Lancashire, the scale was vast and the rhythm relentless. The comet and the octopus, the beaver, the hippo, the steer, the names alone tell you something about the confidence of the place. These were the workhorses of the post-war boom, and they went out across the world by the tens of thousands. A man could start at Leyland at 16, as Stokes himself had, and spend 40 years there and watch the lorries he helped build go to places he would never see. Up in Glasgow, at Scotstoun, the Albion works built trucks with a Scottish toughness bred into them. Down at Watford, the Scamell men did the impossible as a matter of routine, building, by hand and by eye, the heaviest haulage equipment in Britain. There was a culture in these places that you cannot manufacture and cannot buy. It is built up over generations, passed from a man to the apprentice at his elbow, and it is the most valuable thing an industrial company owns. It is also, as British Leyland was about to demonstrate, the easiest thing to destroy. Because here was the cruel mathematics of what had been built. The skills were real, the reputations were real. The order books, in many cases, were healthy. Guy in Wolverhampton was profitable. The export markets were still open. Everything that made these firms great still existed inside their walls. What had changed was above them. A new structure now sat over all of it, a structure that did not understand, or did not respect, or simply could not protect the particular genius of each separate works. And the first thing that structure would do with all this accumulated brilliance was to take the best engineers in the country and ask them to rush something to market before it was ready. Chapter 7. The engine that should have waited. At Southall, through the early 60s, the AEC engineers had been working quietly on something ambitious. A compact V8 diesel, 12 litres, aiming eventually at 350 horsepower. It was a bold design for its day, and the engineering director, Dr. Albert Fogg, who had come to the company in 1964 from the Motor Industries Research Association, believed in it. A V8 like this needed time. It needed development hours, the long, unglamorous process of running engines until they break, finding out why, fixing it, and running them again. By the time British Leyland formed, AEC's test units had accumulated little more than 300 hours of running. For an engine destined to spend its life hauling 40 tons up motorway gradients in all weathers, that is almost nothing. The engineers knew it. They wanted more time. British Leyland were having none of it. The pressure came down from above. Get the engine into full-scale production. The men at Southall, who knew the engine best, pleaded for delay. They were overruled, and so the AEC V8 went out into the world before it was ready, into the hands of hauliers who had trusted the AEC name for a generation. It was a disaster. The engines overheated. Pistons and liners failed. The crank bearings, too narrow for the loads placed on them, gave out at 50 or 60,000 miles, which for a working lorry is barely the beginning of its life. There is a story, and it has the awful ring of truth, of a commercial motor test vehicle whose engine destroyed its own bottom end within a few miles of leaving the factory. For AEC, this was not merely a failed product. It was the desecration of the one thing the company truly owned, its reputation for engineering integrity. One senior AEC man put it with real bitterness. British Leyland, he said, had turned AEC from an engineering-led company into a guinea pig for every hopeless idea. The V8 was scrapped in the early 1970s, but the damage could not be scrapped with it. The solid engineering reputation of AEC, built over half a century, was in tatters on a global scale. And here is the part that should make you wince. The men who could have prevented this, the AEC engineers who begged for more time, were right. They were proved right in the most public and humiliating way possible. The company had within it exactly the expertise needed to avoid the catastrophe. That expertise was simply not listened to. This was the new British Leyland at work. Not malice, not stupidity exactly. Just a structure that took proud, capable, independent firms and overrode their hard-won judgment in the name of corporate urgency. And the V8 was not the only engine rushed out before its time. There was another, and it would become a kind of legend for all the wrong reasons. Chapter 8. The Headless Wonder. The respected Leyland engine of the era was the 680, a good sound power unit, but it had a persistent weakness. Its cylinder head gaskets failed, and Dr. Fogg's engineering team came up with a radical answer to that problem. If the head gasket keeps failing, they reasoned, then get rid of the head gasket. Get rid of the cylinder head altogether. The result, launched in August 1968, the very year British Leyland was born, was the 500 series engine, a fixed head design of 8.2 litres, in which the cylinder head and block were cast as a single piece. No head gasket to fail, because there was no joint there at all. The men on the floor gave it a name almost immediately. They called it the Headless Wonder. It was a clever idea on paper that turned into a nightmare in practice. Because the head and block were one casting, any work on the valves meant taking the engine substantially apart from below, pulling out the crankshaft and the pistons just to get at the top end. One Leyland executive, Harold Musgrove, described working on it with a phrase that every mechanic who ever touched one would recognize. It was, he said, like a dentist trying to remove a tooth whilst the patient keeps their mouth shut. It smoked heavily. It drank fuel, and it earned a reputation among operators that no amount of marketing could fix. Now here is the bitter irony at the heart of this, and it is the kind of irony that makes this whole story a tragedy rather than just a failure. Remember that engine license Leyland had sold to DAF in the Netherlands? The deal had included the rights to the perfectly good 680 engine, and a clause that let DAF develop it independently. While British Leyland was busy abandoning its own reliable engines for the disastrous headless experiment, DAF and the Swedish firm Scania took proven engine designs and refined them patiently into reliable, powerful units, producing 350 horsepower and more. The good engineering went abroad and flourished. The British engineering, in British hands, was thrown away. The very engine technology that Leyland discarded became part of the backbone of the foreign competition that would soon overwhelm it. The 500 series limped on for years before being quietly dropped. But its failures, and the V8's failures, did something that went far beyond any single product. They taught British hauliers, careful men who counted every penny of running cost, a lesson they would not forget. They taught them that British trucks could no longer be trusted, and just as that lesson was sinking in, a bus came along to teach it to an entirely different audience. Chapter 9. 5 years ahead of the world. The Leyland National was meant to be the future, a single, standardized, modern bus to replace the bewildering variety of models the group had inherited. They built a brand new factory for it at Lilyhall in Workington, opened in 1970 as a joint venture with the state-owned National Bus Company. The styling was done by the celebrated Italian designer Giovanni Michelotti. The first one was delivered in March 1972. And Donald Stokes, doing what Donald Stokes did best, made a claim about it. The Leyland National, he declared, was at least 5 years ahead of world competition. It was a salesman's line, and it came back to haunt him almost immediately. The buses caught fire, not as a figure of speech. 18 of them suffered actual fires. The brackets holding the shock absorbers broke. The doors would not close properly. And the engine fitted to it was a version of that same cursed 500 series, the headless wonder, which smoked so heavily and ran so poorly that operators despaired. At one National Bus Company depot, at one point, as many as 3/4 of the Leyland Nationals on the books were off the road at the same time. 3/4 of a bus that was 5 years ahead of the world. The engine builder Gardner, a firm whose diesel engines were a byword for reliability and economy, had wanted to supply units for the National. Leyland refused, insisting on its own engine. Gardner sued, and eventually, from 1982, the National 2 would quietly appear with the option of a Gardner engine after all, a tacit admission that the operators had been right all along about what they wanted. Ron Ellis, who ran the truck and bus division, conceded with masterful understatement that there had been some problems in commissioning this radically new machine. But the National was only the most visible symptom of something happening across the whole range, something that struck at the very soul of what these companies had been. Because to build all these standardized products, British Leyland was busy erasing the things that had made its constituent firms worth buying in the first place. It had begun back in 1965, before the big merger, with a single tilting cab, the Ergomatic, designed to be shared across Leyland, AEC and Albion. One cab, many badges. It seemed sensible. It was the beginning of the end of distinctiveness. Then the marques themselves began to disappear. AEC's bus production ended in 1968 with the last Routemaster. The Albion name was discontinued in 1972. Guy-badged buses ended that same year. And the AEC name, Builders of London's Buses, the name on that great sign at Southall, a name that meant something real to anyone who knew lorries, simply vanished from vehicles in 1977. A haulier who had bought AEC for 30 years, who trusted the marque, who knew its engines and its quirks and its strengths, was now being handed a Leyland with a different badge. And he was beginning to wonder, quite reasonably, whether he might do better to look elsewhere. There was, in 1973, one genuine bright spot, a lorry called the Marathon, built at Southall, using the trusty old AEC engine, reworked into a reliable unit they called the TL12. It was a good truck. Hauliers liked it. But it arrived into a market that was already changing under Leyland's feet, because by 1973 the haulier looking elsewhere had somewhere else to look. The somewhere else had a Scandinavian name, a tilting cab, a comfortable seat, and a delivery time measured in weeks rather than years, and 1973 would be the peak, the highest point in terms of sheer production that this great troubled enterprise would ever reach. 40,000 lorries a year, a third of the home market. Standing at that summit, surrounded by the noise and the scale and the apparent strength of it all, almost nobody inside those walls could see the cliff edge they were about to walk over. The trucks were already leaving the factories with problems. The foreign rivals were already on the road, and the men who might have fixed it had already been overruled. Chapter 10. The Swede at the Gate. The story of how Britain lost its truck industry to foreign rivals does not begin in a boardroom. It begins with a small Scottish dealership and two men who had the wit to see what was coming before anyone in Leyland did. One was Jim McKelvey, who had sold his own haulage business and was looking for the next thing. The other was Jim Keedon, who had been manufacturing director at Pressed Steel in Linwood. Together, in 1967, they founded a company called Ailsa Trucks, and on the 30th of September that year, they announced that they would market a Swedish lorry in Britain, the Volvo F86. The very first one had already found a buyer. In May of 1967, a haulier named Thomas Hutchinson of Walk-on-Tyne in Northumberland took delivery of a brand new Volvo F86, the first sold in the United Kingdom. In its first full trading year, Ailsa sold just 165 Volvos. 165, against the tens of thousands of British lorries pouring out of Leyland and AEC and the rest. It was nothing. It was a rounding error. It was, as it turned out, the future arriving quietly through a side door. Why did the F86 win? Not through some single dramatic advantage, but through a dozen small ones that added up to a different way of treating the man who drove the lorry and the man who owned it. It had a tilting cab, when most British marques were still fitting fixed cabs of a design that dated back to the 1950s. It had what they called a rest cab, with a shelf a driver could actually sleep on. It had a turbocharged engine and an 8-speed synchromesh gearbox that made it easy to drive. It offered space and comfort where British lorries offered a cramped, noisy box. The driver of a Volvo finished his shift less exhausted than the driver of a comparable British truck, and in an industry where good drivers were worth their weight in gold, that mattered. And then there was delivery. This is the detail that should have terrified Leyland, and apparently did not. A British haulier ordering a new lorry from Leyland might wait up to 2 years for it. 2 years. The man ordering a Volvo could have it in a fraction of that time. When your old lorry is worn out and you need a new one earning money now, a 2-year wait is not an inconvenience. It is a reason to buy a Swedish truck. The bigger Volvo, the F88, added a proper sleeper cab and became iconic on the great overland hauls to the Middle East. The long-distance runs through Europe and Turkey and beyond, where reliability was not a luxury but a matter of survival. British drivers who did those runs began to want Volvos, and the men who employed them began to listen. AB Volvo was watching its little Scottish distributor closely. On the 29th of September 1972, it acquired 75% of Ailsa Trucks and began assembling the F86 in Scotland itself. From that base, Volvo would go on to seize leadership of the British market. The David that arrived with 165 lorries was becoming Goliath, and Volvo was not coming alone. Chapter 11. The things the foreigners did better Scania came too, and Scania was every bit as good. By 1980, the United Kingdom had become the 7th largest market in the world for Scania trucks, with over 1,200 lorries sold in a single year. By the following year, the firm had sold more than 13,000 trucks in Britain in total, a market it had barely touched a decade and a half earlier. What the Swedes understood, and what British Leyland was too distracted to grasp, was that selling a lorry is only the beginning of the relationship. A working truck breaks down. When it does, it needs parts, and it needs them fast, because a lorry that isn't moving is a lorry that isn't earning. The Swedish firms built dealer networks across Europe, multi-language, with round-the-clock emergency call centres, so that a British truck stranded in Italy or Germany or on the road to Tehran could be got going again quickly. The support network was as much a part of the product as the engine. You can see the whole shift in one company's story. Astron was one of the most celebrated of all the British hauliers running to the Middle East, the elite of the long-distance trade. Astron had run Leyland marathons, the good British truck. But the marathons, the story goes, couldn't cope with the desert heat, and the spare parts were hard to find when you needed them 1,000 miles from home. So, Astron switched. Through the 80s, Scania became their lorry of choice. Think about what that switch represented. Here was a British firm running the hardest haulage routes on earth, that had bought British, that wanted to buy British, and that found it could no longer afford to. The foreign trucks were more reliable and better supported, and in that trade, reliability was the difference between profit and ruin. When even the patriots can't justify buying your product, the argument is over. And all of this was happening as the whole market convulsed. In 1979, the total British market for trucks over 3.5 tons hit more than 77,000 registrations, the biggest year on record. Then came the recession of the early 80s. brutal and sudden. By 1981, that market had collapsed to 43,000, a drop of very nearly 60% in 2 years. The water was draining out of the pool at the precise moment Leyland most needed to swim. In a shrinking market, the weak don't merely grow more slowly, they drown. And by now, the question was no longer whether British Leyland could regain its old dominance. It was whether the British heavy truck would survive at all. The answer would be written over the following decade, factory by factory, town by town, and it would begin with a government report that promised salvation and delivered something rather less. Chapter 12. The report that saved nothing. By the end of 1974, British Leyland was in serious trouble, and the government knew it. The company needed a financial guarantee from the state simply to keep going. And so, in the way of British governments, an inquiry was commissioned. It was led by Sir Don Ryder, Lord Ryder, and its job was to chart the next decade of the company's life. The Ryder team worked fast, perhaps too fast. They delivered their report, titled British Leyland, The Next Decade, to Tony Benn on the 26th of March 1975, just 14 weeks after they had been commissioned. 14 weeks to decide the future of 180,000 jobs. What did Ryder recommend? That Britain should remain a maker of vehicles, that British Leyland should be kept whole, not broken up, not slimmed down, but preserved largely intact and split into 4 divisions, one of which would be Leyland Truck and Bus, and that the state should pour in money on a scale that is difficult to comprehend even now, a programme valued at £1.25 billion, which in today's terms runs to well over 10 billion. For the truck and bus division specifically, Ryder did at last recognise something the men there had known for years. The report described Leyland Truck and Bus as the largest commercial and passenger vehicle manufacturer in the country. 31,000 people, at 12 locations, building 38,000 trucks and 8,000 buses and 19,000 tractors a year. And it acknowledged, finally, that this division deserved more autonomy and a greater share of investment. Because for the better part of a decade, its profits had been called upon to support the car factories. The bleeding of the strong to feed the weak was, at last, named in an official document. But naming a problem is not the same as solving it. And the Ryder report, for all its bulk and all its billions, failed in the ways that mattered most. It preserved the excess. It kept factories open and workers employed without imposing the competitive discipline that might have made them viable. It would not confront the central, unbearable truth that British Leyland could not survive as a maker of volume cars against the Japanese and the Europeans. When the report was debated in the House of Commons in May 1975, members pointed out that it had totally failed to deal with the bewildering spread of factories. In 1968, the company had inherited 74 plants. 7 years and 1 major report later, it still had 55. The projections in the report were, in the judgment of those who examined them closely, wildly optimistic. In truth, the Ryder report was less a plan for surgery than a 10-year concept study, produced in effect by the corporation about itself. It was the document of a company and a government that still could not bring themselves to do the hard thing. On the 27th of June 1975, British Leyland Motor Corporation became, simply, British Leyland Limited, with the government as its majority shareholder. Ryder had recommended that Stokes resign as chairman. Harold Wilson, who was his personal friend, kept him on as president instead. The steamroller, you might say, had finally drawn level with the man walking in front of it, but it had not yet run him down. Chapter 13. The Last Good Fight. In 1977, a new man took charge of British Leyland, and he was, at last, the kind of man the company had needed at the very beginning. Michael Edwards was tough, decisive, and unsentimental. He did the thing Stokes never could. He made each division stand on its own feet. He confronted the unions directly, most famously in 1979 when he dismissed the convener Derek Robinson, though Robinson was a car division figure at Longbridge, and it is only fair to the truckmen to say that the worst of British Leyland's industrial strife was never really their story. And Edwards did something else. He invested in the truck side. After more than a decade of being milked to keep the cars alive, the truck division finally got money, a new assembly plant at Leyland, a test track, proper laboratories, and out of that investment came the last real British heavy truck. It was called the T45 road train, and it arrived in 1980. It was a serious piece of work. The cab, designed by Ogle Design under the stylist Dr. Tom Carron and built by Motor Panels of Coventry, was modern and handsome. The truck was good enough to be named International Truck of the Year for 1981. After everything, after the V8 and the headless wonder and the burning buses, British Leyland had built a lorry it could be proud of. But it was too late, and the story of the road train is the story of the whole tragedy in miniature. It launched with only one engine option, when buyers wanted choice. A driver who wanted a sleeper cab had to wait the better part of a year for one. The cabs corroded, a problem not properly cured, until galvanizing was introduced in 1987, years after launch. The good British truck still carried, baked into it, the habits of a company that had spent 15 years not quite getting things right. And then there was the engine. The road train could be had with Leyland's own TL12, the descendant of that fine old AEC unit, the one genuine thread of engineering continuity running back to Southall. But the hauliers no longer wanted it. They wanted Cummins. They wanted Rolls-Royce. They had been so badly burned by British Leyland engines that they would only buy the British truck if it came fitted with someone else's power unit. And so, in 1983, the TL12 was dropped. Sit with what that means. The last great British heavy truck stopped using a British engine, not because the engine was bad, but because the company's reputation was so damaged that operators would not trust anything with the Leyland name cast into the block. The thread that ran back through the AV760 to the great engine-building tradition of AEC was finally cut, and it was cut by the company's own customers, voting with their order books. There were men still fighting for the truck division in these years, the engineering boss, Bill Lowe, among them. But the direction of the senior management told its own story. When Ron Ellis moved across to Ministry of Defence sales, his place was taken by Desmond Pitcher, described as a man with little experience of, or empathy for, commercial vehicles. The people who understood lorries were being moved aside. The road train was a magnificent rearguard action, but it was a rearguard action all the same, and everyone fighting it knew which way the line was moving. Chapter 14. The Marques go dark. What followed was the slow extinguishing of the lights, works by works, name by name, across the industrial map of Britain. And here we must be careful and fair, because the most painful of these closures came after Stokes had left the board in 1979. They were the decisions of other men, in other rooms, under other pressures. The title of this film points at one man. The closures point at many. The first to go was Southall itself. On the 25th of May 1979, the last marathon chassis came down the line at the AEC works, ending 52 years of production. The great sign, Builders of London's Buses, came down. Today the site is wholly redeveloped. There is no trace of it. A passenger on the Great Western Line looking out for that familiar sign would find only the ordinary fabric of West London, with nothing to say that the lorries and buses of a capital city had once been born there. Then, Guy, in Wolverhampton. And the closure of Guy is, in its way, the cruelest of them all, because Guy did not deserve to die. In August 1982, the Fallings Park Works was shut and 740 jobs were lost, at a factory that was one of the few genuinely profitable units in the whole group, with a healthy order book. When the matter was raised in the House of Commons, the local member, Bob Edwards, described Guy as a lamb being led to slaughter, viable, profitable, with orders pending, and asked, in effect, why a company that worked was being killed. The contents of the works were auctioned off that October. Wolverhampton, a town that had already lost 200 factories and 16,000 jobs in that decade alone, lost one more. Bristol Commercial Vehicles closed in 1983, 530 jobs gone as the double-decker bus market collapsed beneath it. At Scotstoun in Glasgow, where Albion had built tough Scottish lorries since before the First World War, vehicle assembly ceased in 1980. The works became an axle plant and is today owned by an American company. At Bathgate, where BMC light trucks had been built since 1961, truck assembly ended in 1985 and the plant closed the following year. And then, in July 1988, Scammell. The kings of heavy haulage, the firm that built the 100-ton articulated lorry and the tank transporters that moved the British Army's armour. Scammell was closed by DAF, and the manner of it was bitter beyond words. The Watford Works had just won a Ministry of Defence contract for over 1,500 vehicles, the Drops programme, exactly the kind of specialist heavy work that Scammell existed to do, and did better than anyone. DF took the contract and moved the work to Leyland. The Tolpitz Lane site, where the impossible had been routine for 67 years, became housing. One of the Scammell engineers, John Fadell, mourned what was lost there, not just the jobs, but the rare and irreplaceable concentration of heavy engineering talent. There had been, he said, great scope at Scammell for young engineers to be handed real responsibility, to learn a craft that existed almost nowhere else. When the works closed, that scope closed with it, and the knowledge it had nurtured began to disperse and fade. This is how an industry dies. Not in a single catastrophe, but in a long series of closures, each one defensible on its own balance sheet, each one taking with it a fragment of accumulated skill that could never be rebuilt. The men who could do these things grew older. The apprentices who would have learned from them went into other trades, and one by one, the works fell silent. Chapter 15. The Last Owner. By the mid-1980s, what remained of British Leyland's truck operation was looking for a partner to survive. In 1986, the wider group was renamed the Rover Group, and the following year, the truck business found its partner and its eventual fate. On the 6th of April 1987, Leyland Trucks, together with the Freight Rover van business, was merged with DAF Trucks of the Netherlands to form a new company, DAF NV. On paper, it was a merger. In reality, it was a reverse takeover. DAF was the smaller company, but DAF held management control. The Dutch firm, the very firm to which Leyland had sold an engine license back in the days of its strength, the firm that had taken British engine designs and made them work, now controlled what was left of the company that had taught it. In Britain, the trucks would be sold under the name Leyland DAF. The bus business was split off separately, sold to its management in 1987, and then on to Volvo in 1988, so that even the Leyland buses ended up, in the end, in Swedish hands. For a few years, Leyland DAF carried on, and then the foundation gave way. The parent company, DAF NV, ran into catastrophic trouble. Its sales across Europe had collapsed, from 70,000 units in 1989 to 31,000 by 1991, and it had accumulated a debt of something like £1 billion by 1992. On the 2nd of February 1993, DAF NV became insolvent, and Leyland DAF was placed in receivership. The receivers, John Talbot and Murdoch MacKillop of Arthur Anderson, were appointed, and here the structure of that 1987 merger delivered its final cruelty. Because the company was now Dutch-controlled, when the crisis came, it was the Dutch government that moved to shore up the Dutch operations. The British end was left to fend for itself. The reverse takeover that had looked like rescue in 1987 meant that in 1993, when it mattered most, the lifeboats sailed for Eindhoven. But the Leyland Works in Lancashire, the original works, where James Sumner's steam van had won its silver medal almost a century before, would not quite die. In June 1993, a management buyout rescued the truck plant as a new company, Leyland Trucks Limited. The van operation was hived off to Birmingham as a separate firm called LDV. The factory and its workers had been pulled back from the edge. Then in 1996, the American truck-making giant PACCAR bought DAF. And in 1998, PACCAR bought Leyland Trucks too. And so, the two companies, the British firm and the Dutch firm it had once supplied with engines, ended up under the same American roof. The wheel had turned all the way round. Chapter 16. The Silence and What Stands in It. So what was lost and what remains? What was lost is almost everything that this story began with. The independent British truck makers, Leyland, AEC, Guy, Scammell, Albion, all of them, are gone as designers of heavy trucks. The marques that meant something to a haulier choosing his lorry, the names cast into radiator grills and stamped on engine blocks, the distinct engineering traditions of Southall and Watford and Wolverhampton, all of it has passed into history. The British heavy lorry, born in that Lancashire town in 1896, was effectively extinct by 1993, less than a century later. Go looking for the physical remains and you will mostly find absence. Southall is built over, the great sign is long gone. Scammell's Watford Works is housing now. Guy's Fallings Park is silent. The places where these things were made have been, for the most part, returned to other uses, with little or nothing to mark what they once were. But the works at Leyland still stands, and this is where the story refuses to be simply a tragedy. Around 1,300 people work there today. The average length of service is 17 years. Some have been there over 40. Men and women who have given their whole working lives to building lorries in that Lancashire town, exactly as Donald Stokes did when he walked through the gates as a 16-year-old apprentice in 1930. They build the full range of DAF trucks, and they export something like 40% of what they make around the world. They even designed DAF's newest model. The skill, it turns out, did not entirely die. It found a new owner and carried on. And the trucks themselves have triumphed, though not under a British name. DF, building on Dutch designs and assembling many of its British market trucks at Leyland, took very nearly 30% of the UK market for trucks over 6 tonnes in 2025, extending an unbroken run of market leadership into a 4th decade. The lorries built at Leyland lead the British market. They simply aren't British lorries anymore. What of the man the title blames? Donald Stokes lived a long time. His first wife, Laura, died in 1995. In 2000, aged 86, as BMW was breaking up the last remnants of the company he had built, he married again. Asked about the fate of the industry he had given his life to, he spoke without bitterness and without self-defense. "I think it is sad," he said, "that it is going into a terminal state of decline." He died on the 21st of July 2008, at the age of 94. Was it one man? The title says so, and it is a powerful accusation, and there is truth in it. Stokes backed away from the painful surgery the merger demanded, and so guaranteed a bloated, quarrelsome company. He let the engineers be overruled, and the bad engines be rushed out. He let the profitable trucks be bled to keep the failing cars alive. He was, as his own finance director said, a salesman where the job demanded a ruthless systems builder. A man with the vision, but not the ruthlessness. But the merger itself was the policy of a government that believed bigger meant better, of Wilson and Ben and Kearton, not of Stokes alone. The hatred between Leyland and AEC was decades old, and no leader could have dissolved it overnight. The Swedish trucks were genuinely, decisively better, and arrived at the precise moment Britain stumbled. Even a perfectly run Leyland would have lost ground to Volvo and Scania, and the cruelest closures, Guy, Scammell, came under other men after Stokes had left the board. The honest answer is that it took more than one man to do this. It took a well-meaning act of central planning, executed by a charismatic salesman who could not make it work, at the exact moment that superior rivals appeared, against a backdrop of failing labour relations and a vanishing protected market. Stokes is the tragic figure at the centre of it, not the lone executioner the title imagines, but a man walking quickly in front of a steamroller he himself had helped to set in motion. It did not happen through a single catastrophe. It happened through a long series of decisions, each one explicable, many of them reasonable on the day they were made, that together moved the building of British trucks, piece by piece, out of British hands, until the only work still standing built someone else's lorries, and the men who had built the lorries of the empire were remembered, where they were remembered at all, by the silence where their works used to be.